Thank you and welcome everyone to this academy. This academy is a bit of a mixed bag. We had some minor ODIN improvements over the last few months. None of them are, I think, big enough to warrant an entire academy because we're probably done in 10 minutes. But we put 3 of them together, so that should be good enough for half an hour. None of the improvements that I'm going to present make something possible that wasn't possible before. Only, as you probably will agree once you have seen them, they make things a lot easier and a lot more easier to read. So let's go to the agenda. Yep. So this is the agenda. The first improvement that we will take a look at are some additions we made to the if statement. You can now combine if statements with else if, and you can make an entire block, or at least you can make a block of if statements stretching several lines if you use an end if. The second one is a random on dummy questions. And then finally, we have released a new timing mechanism, elapsed time, where you can get the exact time a respondent spent on a question. All of these I will shortly talk about, but most of this will be consistent about a demo where I actually show you how to use this and why you would want to use this. And as always, we'll have some time for questions. Then we're not, as I said, I expect this to take about 30 to 40 minutes. So let's start with the if statements. If can now be spread over multiple lines. Until now, if you used an if statement that needed to be on one single line. If you spread your if statements over multiple lines, that requires that the statements is closed with an end if. You can now combine an if with a star else, and you can combine an if with a else if. So those are the improvements. Let's simply go to the demo and take a look what that then means. Close this. Oops. And then first, yeah, I got now a thing blocking my windows. Okay. So let's first take a look, very shortly remind us on how an if statement exactly works. I'm sure you all know how an if statement works. I just want to make it very specifically so we know, so we are all aware of the terms and we are all understanding the terms in the same way. This is the if statement. If statement that consists of 2 things. One is the condition, which is this here between square brackets, and that condition is either true or false. And if that condition is true, then the statement or the action specified is then executed. This is only doing one action, but you can have multiple actions here. You could even have an if statement and then another if statement here. As long as you keep that if statement on one single line, it is considered one single block of if statements. So with that reminder, let's take a look at a slightly more interesting script, which is this one. Here I basically thought of all the combinations that made somehow sense to me, including the new ones, the else and the else if. So we have one where we simply that is the if statement that we already saw previously. So if Q1 1, then we do something. Then we have a second one where we have two if statements on the same line. A third one where we have two if statements on the same line, but then combined with an AND. We have a fourth one where we have one if statement, then we do something, and then we have a second if statement on the same line where we do something. Then we have a statement where we have an or, so this should be true either when this or this is true. And then we have the two new ones, which is one where we, if Q1 is true, we do this, and otherwise else we do something else. This one, same, if Q1 is true, we put that condition state to true, and else if Q1 is true, we put that condition statement to true. All of this do only one thing, they put a condition state either to true or they remain to false. Here, everything that is not set to true is set to false. And then I simply have a block where I put out all the condition states, and then so put out all of the ifs as they are here, with the conclusion whatever the condition state is true or false, and if there is more than one action on that line, which of those actions will be executed. Okay, that sounds maybe a bit abstract, so let's take a look at it. Let me 63, and that should give me the 3 demos that I wanted to use. Yeah, this is the demo for the if statements. Copy the live link. And so I did not load a template for this one. I am using our bare template because there are a few very long lines here, and that gets spread over multiple lines if I use our Chicago template. So let's simply choose code 1, because if you remember correctly, on all those if statements, they were either probing for code 1 or code 2 or a combination of those two. So let's start with only choosing code 1. And there we see the code that we have selected is code 1, and that means that this if statement is true. That means that this if statement is not true, where we put those two ifs on the same line. That means that this if statement AND is not true because it's an AND, and this more or less functions as an AND too. This if statement where we have an action if Q1 is true and then another action if Q2 is also true is true, but only the first action will be executed, not the second one, because this one is not true. Then 1 or 2, that one is true because 1 is true, and then we have the new ones, the else. So if Q1 action else another action, that one is true, and the first action will be executed because the action before that else is true. And then we have the other one, else if Q1 is one action, and then else if we do this one if 2 is true, but this time again it is true, but only the first action will be executed because 2 isn't true. Okay, so that it's, let's the next one a bit quicker, and now we are only going to choose code 2. So this time first one is not true because it's 2 and not 1. The second one is not true because, as I said, this functions like an AND and only one of them is true, so the AND isn't true either. Then if Q1 action, if Q12 action is not true, and it's not true because Q1 isn't true and it isn't even looking at this one. Although this one is true, it isn't even getting to this one because Q1 isn't true. Then if Q1 or Q2, that one is true because 2 is true. And then we have the else. The Q1 is not true because this is code 2, so it executes the else. So this one is true and the second action will be executed, which is the else. And then the else if Q1, again, this is not true, else if Q1 action, that one is true, so the second action will be executed because the Q1 2 is true. Now, again, let's make this slightly more interesting and choose code 1 and code 2. Well, that happens. So the first one is true because code 1 has been selected. The second one is true because, as I said, this more or less functions like an AND and they are both true. So the AND is true as well. And then Q1 action, if Q1 action, the first one will be executed and the second one will be executed because Q1 is true. So it executes this one and then it continues with doing this one, and that one is also true. So both the first and the second action will be executed for this one. Then we have the if statement, which is true because, yeah, they're both true. Then the else, if Q1 we do an action, else we do something else, that one is true, and the first action will be executed because Q1 is true. And then finally the else if Q1 we do an action and else if we do this action, this one is true, but only the first action will be executed because this one is true and it does not even look at this one then. So that one here is different from this one, where we do not have an else if, because in this instance, both of these actions will be executed. In this instance, only the first action will be executed because it doesn't even look beyond the else if. That's why it's an else. So these were code 1 and code 2. So let's choose code 1 and code 3. See what we then get. 1 is true because code 1 is true. 1 and 2 is not true because only 1 is true. The same is true for the next end. Then we have the if Q1 action, if Q2 action. That one is true, but only the first action will be executed. If Q1 or Q2 action, that one is true because Q1 is true. And then we have Q1 else. Q1 is true, so the first action will be executed. The else is not executed. And the else if is the same. Q1 is true, so the first one will be executed, not the second one. Almost done with this one. Let's do 2 and 3. Q1 not true. If Q1, if Q2 is not true, because as I said, this functions like an AND and only one of them is true. Same is true for this one. If Q1 action, if Q2 action is not true, because Q1 isn't true, and which means it basically stops here. It doesn't even look at this action anymore. If Q1 or Q2, that one is true because Q2 is true. If Q1 action, else other action, and we do that second action because Q1 isn't true. If Q1 is true, we do this action, and else if Q2 is true, we do the second action, and Q2 is true, so that second action will be executed. And now for the very last iteration of this one, let's only choose code 3. Everything is not true because nowhere we are selecting 1 or 2 except for the else statement, because that one simply says if it is not 1, then do this. So that one is true, and the second action will be executed. Everything else is not true because it is failing either because it isn't 1 or because it isn't 2. Okay. So look at all the different iterations of that if statement. Now, as I said, let's go here. What you could look up on of this if is one single big block of an if statement. And as you can see, this one is going off the page, so it's not very clear what is happening here. And in order to make this a little bit more understandable, we are now allowing you to spread these if statements over multiple lines, in which case you of course have to close them. Let me switch to I don't have them yet. Let me then in this case save this. Save as if split because I'm going to change it and I want to use it tomorrow as well. Yeah. Okay, so suppose we want to put this if statement over multiple lines. We simply make it more understandable. Let's isolate it from the other if statements. We simply go to the statement if Q1 is true, next line, put condition state is true, and then we say and if. And that's it. Now we have splattered over multiple lines. Now for this one particular one, that might not be very useful, but as I said, for these ones that actually run over the entire length of the screen, it could be very insightful to actually start splitting these. So if Q1 is 1, this is one condition. There is a second condition that we also do if Q1 is 1. And then we have a else here. And we have two conditions we execute for that else. And then finally, we need to close this with and if. And I could even make this even more insightful by tapping in this one, tapping in this one, tapping in this one, and tapping in this one. And then we have a very clear overview. If Q1 is 1, then these two conditions will be executed. Else, these two conditions will be executed. So this makes your scripts way more readable if you turn such a long single line of if block, if you spread that over multiple lines, and certainly if you then use the indentation here, it becomes very clear what it is doing. One last thing that I wanted to show you before we move on to the order on dummy questions, and that is if you have, sometimes we see these surveys where there is an enormous line of if statements, and basically these if statements are all probing for one single thing. Each run, only one of these things is true, but you have to probe for each and every single one of them, which means that each time all these if statements are run. If you have if statements like this, from now on, please make sure that you start them with an if statement, then change everything else in this line to else if, provided of course only one of them is true, and then end this with an else, with an end if. Why should you do that? Very simple. If the first of this line is true, if you do it like this, which until now was the only way you could do this, It will also run through all the other if statements, which are all in true. If you use else if, as soon as it meets one if statement that is true, it won't check all the other ones anymore. So it will make the execution of your script a lot quicker, especially in KP. Okay, any questions at this point, Art?
No, Frank, all is clear. Yeah.
Then I continue with the order on if statements. So let me very quickly go to the present again. So we done the demo. So next of the improvement is that we now allow you to place a random or an order on a dummy question. Until now, we did not allow that, or we did allow it, but it didn't do anything because that dummy question is never displayed. And those random and those orders only took effect once they were displayed. But now, if you actually do a random on a dummy, that question will be randomized, which sounds kind of useless, but you can then use that randomization on a dummy question on another question. So that makes it easier to create a specific order. And it also makes it easier, and this is the one thing that I will demo, it makes it easier to run a repeat loop in a specific order. That sounds a bit abstract, so let's simply go into the demo and I think it will become clear. So let's go into the demo. And the example I will be using is an example which will probably be familiar to most of you. Mainly the example of least filled brands, where we want to pick a least filled brand that the respondent actually knows. I'm not going through this entire list, but through this entire if statement here. But that means that we need to start a repeat where we first select the least filled brand, and then in the next one we actually start selecting. We start checking if the respondent knows that, and then we select that brand if the respondent actually knows that brand. Now, because we are using a least filled list, we actually have an array that is exactly in the order from least filled to most filled, and that array we could from now on use on a dummy question. So let me check split to the next one, and that is what I'm actually doing here. So we have a question 10 here where we actually ask, okay, which do you know? We use this list of brands. Then we have the get least filled command, and then we have the dummy question, which is the actual quota question. And this one we order on brand name, and brand name, that is the array that is returned that for the least filled list with least to most filled. So this then sets question 11 in the order from least filled to most filled. And then we use a repeat where we simply say, do this repeat in the order of question 11. So in the order from least filled to most filled, and we control it on Q10, which is which of these ones do you know? And then we simply run that repeat once and we immediately enter, and the first item we find, that is the least known item, the least filled brand that this person actually knows. I do it here only for once, but if you want to have 2 or 3, simply run it 2 or 3 times before you enter it. I do something more here. Let's skip that for now. I will return to that. Let's simply run this to actually make sure that it works. So let me go to manager. And this time we are using the dummy least filled quota. And let's immediately go to the monitor screen. I already done a few interviews. So as you can see, brand C is the most filled, brand B is the least filled. And then we have one with 3 and the other ones are 2. So let's copy the live link for here. And let's say we are going to run a survey and we're going to pick C, H, D, and E. Let's simply do that. Yep. So we're going to pick C, H, D, and E. And we'll see the brand that is selected is D. Let's very quickly check if that is correct. D is indeed one of the 2 brands that only have 2 successfuls. The other one is E. So it should either have selected D or E, and it did. Next one is where it actually says that it has selected brand D, and brand D is at position 2 of the list. And that one, let me step back here, is important for what is happening here, where actually start to figure out, okay, on what position is the brand that I have selected here, on what position on the index is that, and why is that important to know? That is important to know because we also have returned a number of available brands, which is the from this number onwards, the brands are quota full. So it's important to know on which position this actually is, because if that position is higher than the number of available brands, that actually is quota full, and we can go to quota full. Okay. So this makes it a lot easier to actually find a least filled. There's of course one requirement here if you want to use that order on that dummy, and that needs to be that the list that is returned needs to be, you need to be able to relate that to a number list which is clearly numbered from 1 to 8, because otherwise that repeat loop won't work, and then you need to use the old-fashioned way. Okay, one last, yeah, we can do one last thing, because let's choose one more C and H and see what, oh no. Let's use C and H and see what happens. And the brand chosen is A, which again is correct because that one was the least filled for those 2. Oh, I realize I've done something which I shouldn't have done. I ended this one interview, which I should not have done because I now messed up my counts. But anyway, okay, so that is for the order on the dummy questions. Now let's move on to the last item, which is the timings. So let's continue from the current slide. So this is the random order on dummy. We done the demo on this one. So now the timings. We created a new command, which is elapsed time. Elapsed time, or rather function. Elapsed time returns the number of seconds spent on a question or questions. If that question is visited multiple times, the elapsed time will return the sum of all of those visits. When you are using that elapsed time inside a repeat, That is context depending, which means if you are using it inside a repeat, it will return the value of that question for that current iteration. If you refer to it outside a repeat, it will return the sum of all those visits. For matrix block or block, the elapsed time returns the total time spent on that matrix or block. So if you have multiple questions in that matrix or multiple questions in that block, it will only return the total time spent on that one matrix or that one block, and it will return that as value of the last question in that matrix or block. And finally, skipped questions due to routing will be returned with duration 0. Now, might sound a bit abstract again, so let's take a look at the last demo where it hopefully all becomes clear. Come on. So let's back to our surveys. And this is the survey we are going to use, which is the timing survey. Let's also take a very quick look at the script, although the script isn't very, the script is pretty basic. Timings. So we start with a question before any of the timings, before we start any of the timings. Then we do a date command, because the first few times we will compare that elapsed time with the timings that you use to get to the date commands, and that will make clear why you would want to use the elapsed time from now on and no longer rely on the date command. So for the first time, then we actually do the date command, and we see the difference between the date command and the elapsed time. And here you see how that elapsed time exactly works. Elapsed time, and then between brackets, you actually name the question that you want to have the time on. And we have a few more here, but this is the gist of it. Let's simply run that survey and let's take a look at the Q file when that is needed. Let's simply run the survey. So let's copy the live link. Let's do this and let's give it a respondent ID, because I want to pause it and return to it at some point. So that's the respondent ID. So first is the question before any timing command, which is the first question that we take a look at. Then we have that first timing block where we only have one question inside that block. So let's move onward. And as you can see, the duration as noted by date was 9 seconds. The duration noted by elapsed time is way more specific, until the thousands of seconds, but it's 8.2. Well, so not much difference between here. This is a question of cutoff points. Now, what will happen if we go back to the previous question and then move forward again? Well, let's actually do that. We go back. So this is that only question in the first timing block, and we move forward again. And now we have a substantial difference. As you can see, the duration as captured by date is now almost a minute, while the duration captured by the elapsed time is 14 seconds. And this is actually correct. This is really the time spent on that question, or rather it is the sum of the two times that we visit that question. And why is this one much bigger? Well, if you look at the script, that becomes clear. Here we have a date command, then the only question in that first timing block, then the second date command, and we calculate the date command by subtracting those two, and then we move back and we move forward again, and this date command is executed again, so we get the entire duration of this thing. While if we only ask for the elapsed time, we actually only get the time spent on this question, so that is way more accurate. So now what will happen if I go back to the question before any command and then move forward again? So let's do that too. So this is the previous question, and then we move one question more forward, and this is the question before we actually issued the first date command as well, and then we move forward again, and we move forward again. And there it's exactly the other way around. The date gives now way too little time, only 2 seconds, while the elapsed time still gives us the correct time spent, the correct seconds spent in the 3 visits to this question. So next one. This is actually a timing block. So there are 3 questions within that block, and I want to know the duration for those 3 questions combined. So this is the first question in the timing block, the second, and this is the third question in the second timing block. As you can see, the duration as captured by date is 22 seconds. The duration as captured by elapsed time is 21 again. Way more detail, but this is the same. How do you do this? If you look at the second timing block, and then date is pretty much the same thing. We do a date command, we have a second date command, and we subtract the two. The elapsed time, we simply say the 3 questions that we want to have for that elapsed time. So that those are 20, 21, and 22, and it will it will return the sum of those 3 questions. Okay, then next one. So we have a third timing block with 3 questions inside that timing block. I go to the next one. This is the second question in the third timing block, and this time we are going to pause the survey. So I'm going to click on pause. And we have paused this interview, and this is the reason why I used a respondent key. This one, the Tuesday Academy. And we restart that survey, and we get to the second question in the third timing block, because that's where we paused the survey. And now we will continue. And we continue in the third time. And let's see what that means for the time that we got. Again, if you look at the date command, it will tells us 46 seconds. 46 seconds because it also includes the time and pausing the survey, while the elapsed time correctly says that it took 32 seconds to do those 3 questions, because it does not take into account the time a survey was paused. Do keep in mind this works if you click on pause. If you do not click on pause, but if someone simply closes his browser, it's not a paused interview, it's a dropped out interview, and it will take 15 seconds. It will take about 15 minutes for the dropped out interview, for the dropped out status to be to become a dropped out, and those 15 minutes will be added to that question. But even then, it will only add those 50 minutes. It will not, if that question is then resumed a day later, the daytime will still have way more time than the elapsed time. In case you wonder, how could I tell whatever this has happened? Or maybe even how could I tell if a question was visited multiple times? You can do this in the audit log. So let me, the audit log is one of the files that you can download. I already did that for this survey, which is this file. And in this file, you can recognize if someone has moved back to a survey, because that is what it will say here. The navigation action is back. So this is where you, if you get a suspiciously high number for one single question, you think, okay, maybe that person moved back. This is where you can check if that indeed happened. Suspend. So this is where a pause button has been entered. And otherwise, what you will see is a timed out. And as you can see, that then includes those 15 minutes. Okay. Then this is all we done for the date. From now on, I still have a few examples, but these are all only about elapsed time. So remember what I already told you in the introduction of the elapsed time. What you get inside a repeat is context depending. So let's take a look at this repeat in the Q file, which is here is the repeat 3 times. And then we have one inside this repeat where we do a elapsed time for 41, and we have one where we do an elapsed time outside this repeat 40 for Q41. So if I do it the first time here, and remember we are now inside the repeat, that will get me a pretty high number now, almost 60 minutes, because I spent some of this time showing the script. If we then move to the next one, and this one, it will now say something like, I assume 7 seconds, because this is the actually time that we spent on the second iteration of this question. We go to the third one, and it will now say 4 seconds. So we have almost a minute, 7 seconds, and 4 seconds. So that should be the total should be somewhere in the 70s. And here, indeed, the repeat has ended. And I again asked the same question, but this time what is returned is actually the sum of all of those repeat questions. Indeed, early in the 70s. So next step. This is a matrix question. So that is this one matrix. This is a mixed matrix. So I actually have 2 questions in here, 51 and 52. Let's run this one very quickly. So I have 2 questions here, which means I can actually ask the elapsed time for 2 questions, but that, as you will see here, is a bit pointless, because the duration of the first matrix questions is 0, and the duration of the second matrix question, that one is actually 36, and that is the duration of the entire matrix question. So if you are requesting elapsed time from a matrix question, and that is a matrix question with more than one question, you have to be aware which one is the last question, because that is the question that will hold the elapsed time for that entire question. Now, the same is true for a block. We have the first question in the block and the second question in that block. If I move to the next page, again, the first question in that block is 0, because everything, the entire duration of that block, is put in the last question of that block. This time that was 10 seconds. That okay, this one is about what happens if we skip a question due to routing. So let's very quickly take a look at the script to see what then happens. Yeah, let's simply do it. Which question to show? Let's say we only want to show 71. And then it shows question 71, which means that we have skipped question 72. And as you can see, question 71 actually has a number of seconds, the seconds that we spent on that question. 72, the one that we skipped, has 0 seconds. So if you skip a question, the number of seconds in that question will become 0, not empty, not null, 0. Okay. Now, what happens if we do the same thing in a block? So we have a first question in the block and then the second question in the block where we actually say show the third question in this block or do not show the third question in that block. So let's say we do not want to show the third question in that block. We do that one. And as you can see, because this is a block, the last question of that block will hold the total seconds for that block, even if that question isn't shown. So again, if you want to know the duration of a block, you need to be aware what is the last question of that block and get that duration from that question. And this is the last one. Now, what happens if I allow a non-response on a question? So for this question, I can immediately click on next because it is allowing me a non-response, and you will still get the duration of that one question, even if you allow a non-response. So 0 is only for questions that are skipped or for questions in a matrix or a repeat or a block that are not the last question of that matrix or block. Okay, then we'll return to the presentations. Any questions, Art?
One question came in, Frank. Will you be sharing the demo files that you are using for this demo?
I need to see if that makes sense.
Okay. No other questions.
Okay. Okay, then. Let me move to the last questions then, to the last. So questions we already done. Then the final remarks. Recordings are available later this week. The manuals are updated. If you have any suggestions for a topic, please write to your help desk. I now realize that I skipped over something important, I think. Yeah. This is the one that needs some attention. All of these things that I've shown you are already released, but be aware that this is only supported from the ODIN developer version 5.19.0.1 onwards. So if you have a lower version than that and you want to use any of this, please update your developer, so your developer also understands these commands. And then we get to the one thing that I want to close on with. We will start a run of academies where we are going to repeat some of our previous academies. We started these academies as academies that would explain you how to use the KP manager and how to use the online manager. We did that years ago, and all those years we have added functions, and then we did a new academy where we explained those added functions. We think it is now time that we actually rerun a few of those things and actually make sure that we have one place where we one time explain to you how the KP manager work, and one time where we explain to you how the online manager works, and then we can take all of those older academies where this is all spread over 20 different academies with sometimes very outdated interfaces. We can take all of those offline. We will start doing this for the next 2 weeks. We will start doing this in 2 weeks. It will take probably a few months to run all of these academies. We will do one academy per week. We will only run those academies one time each week because there is nothing new in those academies. It's all basically refreshing. We will start with KP, and once we're done with KP, we will start rerunning the online academy. So if you are a KP client, you will get an invite to those KP academies next week. That's it. Thank you. If there are no further questions.
No.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Talk to you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.